walks in, like, we want you into the bathroom. So I announced it to you guys. I'll feel a little, kind of glad that I'll finish it. Yeah, I already like help you out inappropriately. Hello, is this on? Hello?
We need this? Yeah. Welcome. Thank you for coming. See some TSU sweatshirts. That's good. Crossed over a couple miles. Thank you so much for being here. Just gonna hold it. I feel like Britney Spears. I'm Jody Hayes. I'm the gallery director over at TSU. Also touch in our art department. Thank you for Vanderbilt for hosting and collaborating on this. I think it's a relevant topic. Glad to see some men here. You know that you can be included on this discussion. Thank you to Diane Acree in the Vandy office for making sure we had everything we needed for tonight, including the chairs, tables, all that stuff. Also to Carlisle Johnson, who's the department head over at TSU's Department of Art. Just if you're interested as well, and if you're able to do something during the day, Watkins is hosting Isha Cousins tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning for an informal artist talk. And she just did one of those for some of our students at TSU this afternoon. As many of you know, Tennessee State University hosted a similar panel discussion on the Black male in art and education in the fall. So this is a mirror version of that panel talk. If you missed it, it's on the TSU gallery website, so you can find it. That was featuring Sean Leonardo, Nathan Creekmore, Samuel Jensen, and Michael McBride, and Dr. Graham Matthews. I owe much of the intention of this panel to a woman named Nina Lovelace, who many of you might know. She's an educator and an artist, graduated from Fisk, was schooled at Skowhegan, which many of us are incredibly jealous of. She got in and did that. She and Alicia Henry are two of the alums that I know of in Nashville who went to Skowhegan. And she's taught at TSU for years. She's unable to be here tonight, I think, but just an amazing force. So a lot of the intentionality of this discussion and also the Black male panel was kind of inspired by her. Before we begin, I'd urge you to check out the art programming that the Studio Art Department does here on campus, and also the Art History, the Fine Art Gallery. Saunter over to Fisk and TSU if you want to jaunt over a couple of miles. I'm going to go ahead and introduce the panelists, and some of us have images, or some of them have images because we're visual people. Some don't, and that's okay. Dr. Nguyen is not an artist, and I think it's incredibly important in a panel to kind of fill out a panel with several different voices. I know Dr. Matthews' voice as an educator was really important. Okay, so working out introductions. Aisha Cousins is an artist from Brooklyn. She's just come back from exhibiting or sharing her work called Diva Dutch, which is currently in the TSU gallery. It's a performance piece that she'll show some images about. So she comes here straight from Brooklyn this morning. So we're glad that she's a part of this. She's also going to do her project called Diva Dutch on TSU's campus or in Nashville in the fall. So this is kind of a way to think about the landscape of Nashville and how a project might change with geography. Oberlin College. Then we've got Amelia Winger-Bearskin, who has a lovely son, Tristan, over here, who wanted to introduce her. And Carlin Wing. They've collaborated. Amelia's a Vanderbilt visiting professor this year, and Carlin was also at Vanderbilt this last semester and is now at Watkins. Two artists who've collaborated on a project at Scarrett Bennett Center, Gallery F. So if you haven't seen that, it's worth a short jaunt over there to see some compelling work based on some narratives on a story at the Hermitage, Andrew Jackson's home. So please do see that, and they'll flesh that out a bit in their introduction and their talk. Cynthia Gadsden's an educator, an artist, and also an editor with a keen eye. I hear a lot of students always complain about her keen editing eye. So she comes at this panel not only from as a visual person and educator, but as a writer, and somebody who comes from that background. And finally, last but not least is Dr. Jewel Wynn. I've met her in several capacities at Tennessee State University, but she's a positive force on many levels in her job in facilities management and events management, but she's also involved in a project at TSU, beginning a new women's center at TSU. So I'd love for her, I'm sure she's going to come from that perspective tonight. I am going to allow for a lot of question answer. I was telling Aisha this morning I would have loved to kind of pass out green tea and made this a little less formal and academic in setting. Not that we're not incredibly thankful for the hosting, but just to allow for a little more conversation. So I have a couple of questions I'll ask after they introduce their work or the images or their responses to the image of the Black female in art and education. But I also encourage you guys to jump in whenever you want. Don't feel like you have to wait for my question, although I'll be over here, so it'll be awkward. So we'll begin with Cynthia Gatson.
Can everybody hear me? Can you hear me? Okay. When I started to think about this whole topic of the Black female in art, there were two words that kind of came to mind: silence and voice. And as we go through the images, I think you'll get a better idea of kind of why those two came to mind and why they're kind of important to me. When I was little, one of the first images that I remember of the Black female in any kind of art was in film. Came home from school one day and my mom was busy cooking dinner and got us, at the table. We sat down, we ate really quickly, and it's like, what's going on? And we were, getting ready to go to the movies. I said, oh, great, what are we going to see? Sounder. Okay. So, we go to see this movie and the dog's name is Sounder. So I'm thinking, great, we came to see a movie about a dog. And my family we didn't do that kind of thing often. So it really stuck out in my mind. But one of the things that the movie was about a Black family, mom and dad. Mom was played by Cicely Tyson, dad by Paul Winfield. They had a couple of kids. It was a story of a sharecropper's family. Don't remember that much about the film, but remember the image of this mother. World weary, world on her back, having to keep the family together against tremendous odds, great poverty, not a lot of education. But also lots of wisdom. So this mother wisdom, larger than life kind of character. Then around the same time, Get Christy Love. When I started to remember this particular image, I thought this was also a movie. So when I went online to get images, I found out it was actually a TV show. So I thought, oh my gosh, I watched this weekly. And so here we have this contrasting image of, smart mouth, streetwise, in your face, gun toting, karate kicking woman with not so many clothes on. So we juxtapose that between this world-weary mother and this Get Christy Love. So we have these women that they're vocal in a way, but whose voices are they expressing? went to school, got a couple of art, business degrees, and at some point decided I was going to go back to school and get an art degree. So, began taking art classes, very excited to learn about all of this and to learn all about, just really had a real thirst and quest for art. And these were images like this one and the next one. These were the images I was confronted with. And so I kept wondering, where are the women that I grew up with? Where are the women like my grandmother who, not a lot of education, but was an entrepreneur? She was a laundress, but she also took in boarders. Where are the women like my mother? Where were the women like my mom's friends? Where were those images? And how was I to connect with women that I understood and women that I knew based on what I was seeing? Oh, go back, I'm sorry. Yeah. Based on what I was seeing and based on the images that I was confronted with. I didn't see those images. And so even in my own art practice, I began to look for these women that were much more substantial, that were much more rounded, because the women that I had seen before and the images I had seen before were very flat, not necessarily just in terms of two-dimensional, but in terms of substance even, in terms of voice. These women were silent. So I was looking for women that could express themselves, that could speak to me, speak for themselves. And so I actually discovered a couple of books by Marita Gimudas, I believe it was. And her work focused on these ancient matriarchal civilizations. And I found, I found this particular image, this full-bodied, round, strong image of a woman. Also an earth mother, but one that speaks volumes, and actually that I connected with. And so out of that, I began to look for images of, in my own art practice, images that that allowed me to have some expression, that it allowed me to speak, because I was also feeling quite silenced as well. And so with Waterbird, it's not necessarily one of those images, but comes out of that that spirit of that freedom to express to it and to express freely. And Venus 2 comes out of that as well.
Very strong.
Huh?
Very strong.
No, these are actually prints. These are collagraphs. And then I also found Elizabeth Catlett. And I watched a video with my students recently. Faith Ringgold actually introduced her and talked about that Elizabeth Catlett's women, the women that she creates are not silent. They have voice. And I was really looking for images that of women that were reflective of not only just full-bodied women, and rounded women, but not just physically, but also in terms of their passions, in terms of their lives, and their life experiences. So often we are confronted with images that that don't show us that don't connect to real people, that don't connect to women that have children, that are wives, that are divorced, married, have particular passions around art. One of the things that I can remember my mom doing, my mom was a teacher, she was an educator, but my mom was also an artist. You know, you won't find her in any kind of art book, you won't find any of her friends' names in any kind of art book. But they got really excited about taking classes, and my mom painted, my mom did collage. So those are the kind of women that I was continually seeing and relating to and being involved with. But so often I just didn't see those kinds of women reflected in the art I was seeing, in the images that I was seeing. And so I was really striving personally for some kind of connection to what I know, what I've seen. And I talk about this whole topic really in terms of myself, kind of the personal, but I really do think that the personal is also the professional, the private is the public, because so often our motivations for the public and the professional come out of that private, come out of that private space. So that's kind of, when I started to think about this, it's kind of the journey that my thinking took.
We'll go through these and then I'll bring up your other chapter.
I was just, it's a really interesting topic, and there's so much that can be said on it in terms of the Black female image in art. And so what I decided to focus on was the contemporary images that I've seen, and also specifically the ways that Black women see images of ourselves versus how people who aren't Black women sometimes view images of us, and then what creates that difference. And so what I decided to do was to pick images from work by 3 artists that I've seen over the past year that has had a strong impact on me in some way, in terms of, not necessarily in terms of the art itself, but in terms of the experience of viewing it. And so the first image is from the Kara Walker show. I'm sorry, how's everyone doing? Doing all right? If I talk too fast or too low, please feel free to let me know. Sometimes I do either. And I won't be offended at all. But I went to go see the Kara Walker show at the Whitney because it was there, and she's a really well-known Black artist, and I wanted to support in some ways. And I, for whatever reason, had always, I guess, looked at her art in environments that were predominantly Black, for whatever reason, and I just ended up that way. And so I went to the Whitney to go see it, and so there was a whole floor, and there were various rooms, and then as I moved in out of the rooms, it became a much different experience for myself, and you could also kind of see that happening for the people who were viewing it as well. You know, so I'd go into one room and I'd be the only Black person in the room, or myself and the other person that came with me would be the only Black person in the room. Is everyone familiar with Kara Walker's work? Is anyone not familiar with Kara Walker's work? Okay, raise your hand. Oh wow. Okay. Let me see if this is a good. She does silhouettes, which is in some ways a very kind of old-fashioned, traditional, kind of antique art form. But then when you look at them, there's a lot of grotesque within this beautiful, sort of seemingly beautiful form. And in some ways, I kind of like the aesthetic of that because I think it's an experience that, I don't know, I definitely resonate with some way, and I think it's something that there are certain works that I like that capture that. Like, for instance, Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit kind of captures that feeling of finding, you know, approaching something that at first look is beautiful, but then the more you get involved in the history of it, as a Black person, you look at it and you sort of see that it really is very grotesque. And I felt that Kara Walker's work in some way kind of captures that feeling, because at first glance you look at it and it seems like this very proper, old-fashioned, beautiful art form, and then you look at it and a lot of the things that she's depicting are very grotesque, essentially. And I think also what I liked about it was that in some ways it deals with the question of the ways in which, when there's a continuous cycle of abuse, the way that it becomes ingested and people start to do it to themselves in some ways, which is just a psychological thing that happens with human beings. And people talk about it, for instance, in cases of domestic violence, like just now with Chris Brown and Rihanna. Does everyone know about Chris Brown and Rihanna? Does anyone not know about Chris Brown and Rihanna? Okay. So everyone knows about, what happened and how seemingly this very nice guy all of a sudden lashes out at this woman, and then he has a background of domestic violence in his family. And so even though as a child he swore that he would never obviously do that sort of thing, as he became an adult, it sort of manifested itself in him. And that's sort of a psychological response that human beings have that in some ways doesn't make sense, but nevertheless happens throughout time. And so I think it raises interesting questions, but again, I had never seen it in a mixed audience, and it was interesting going and looking at her work and then sort of being the only Black person in the room and being very uncomfortable and wondering whether or not people were looking at it as just her ponderings on the subject and just her personal opinions, or whether they were taking it as something that represented everyone's point of view across the board. And there's a lot of backlash from African American artists in response to Kara Walker's work, and I think that's a large part of it. It's just that fear that because she's such a prominent artist, that she may very well go down in history as doing this work that will go down as history as representing all of us, which is a little disturbing. And I hadn't thought of it that way until I saw it in a mixed audience, and just realizing that even though I was looking at it just as a personal expression from her, that other people might look at it as an across-the-board kind of thing. And then the next thing that I saw that was of interest to me in terms of how people view things and why was by LaToya Ruby Frazier. Has anyone heard of her work? I saw her at, you have? Oh, that's excellent. Where did you see her work at?
Heard of that.
She's, I saw her work at a Skowhegan talk, and it was her and Lorraine O'Grady, and they do these really wonderful talks where they have people who've been professors in the program and then people who've gone through the program. And so they had Lorraine O'Grady, whose work I had just seen at PS1. She did this piece called Mademoiselle Bourgeois, where she wears this ball gown that's made entirely out of kind of debutante gloves. And it's a performance art piece that she does. So I just heard about that, just seen it and liked it. And she was there talking about her work, and she was an old artist. And then LaToya Ruby Frazier was there, and she was showing her photos. And what she's been doing for about the past 5 years is documenting predominantly her relationship with her mother, but also her relationship with the rest of her family. And the interesting thing about it is that it just so happens that her mother is someone who has been addicted to drugs all of her life. And so, I don't know, I find that photos really interesting, and we were talking just at the panel and then also afterwards about how people look at images of, how people look at those kind of images and when those images have appeared in the past and who's been making them, and the stereotypes that surround those, and how she really, actually I should read from her statement, but she very purposefully did them and involved her mother in making the images as well, and involved her family in making the images, because she wanted to be a portrait of her mother as a person, and not necessarily a portrait of a stereotypical Black woman who was a drug addict, because she doesn't see her mother as a drug addict. That's not all that her mother is to her. Her mother is a person, and so her mother, it's all those things that your mother is to you, someone that you look up to over time, someone who holds power, someone who is a reflection of you. So all those things come out in her work. And I wrote her and asked her if I could show some of her images, and I think it's kind of indicative of the subject that she was very much, she had a lot of questions about why I wanted to show them and who I wanted to show them to and what was the purpose and which images did I want to show. And she actually, she made it very clear that she didn't want, she doesn't allow people to show the 2 images that she has of her mother taking a hit. But I think that has in many ways to do with playing into stereotypes and being afraid that people will only see her mother as that. for whatever reason. But so I chose these images, this one, and there's also one of her and her mother together. And again, for her, it's very much about their relationship. Her mother didn't raise her, her grandmother raised her, because her mother is very functional, but at the same time, not functional, probably not responsible enough. It was probably a wise decision to not have her mother be the person that raised her. And so as a teenager and becoming an adult, going into art school, taking photos is how she gained a relationship with her mother and sort of figured out what her mother meant to her. And they developed more relationship over time through this process of photography. But the other interesting thing that came up in talking with her was the various responses that she's gotten from people that have more to do, again, with how people view things. And so she's found that when she shows the pieces, a lot of middle-class Black people are really critical of the images and don't want her to show them because they're afraid that people who aren't Black will see them, and it will basically reinforce whatever negative images are already out there that are being made by other people. But the other thing that's really interesting is that I think because it's something that she's making herself, she's making them of her mother's involved in them, and they're very three-dimensional portraits, that actually what often happens is that the opposite happens. People often come up to her after she shows the work and tell her about how drug addiction, which is really something that's a problem throughout the country for everyone, has ripped apart their families. And so it actually really has the opposite effect, where one would be afraid that it might play into stereotypes, but it really actually sort of gets under them. And so that was really interesting. And the next person is Wanda Raimundi Ortiz, who's Latina, but as I was telling Jody earlier today, I've really been thinking a lot lately about what makes us decide to really differentiate between Black people that speak English and French and Black people that speak Spanish. Or to say that people who were brought to this part of the globe through the slave trade who speak English and French are somehow distinctly separate and different from those who speak Spanish, and kind of what makes us decide to do that and whether or not that really is truly logical in a way. And so I happen to be really, I had a very strong response to Wanda's work. These are her Wepa Woman murals. And Wepa Woman is a superhero that she invented. I met her at the Skowhegan talk, and she's actually been trying to get away from doing these murals, but people respond really positively to them, so she keeps sort of getting sucked into doing them over and over again. But I really love the character. The character is a sort of Wonder Woman character who's a Latina woman, but I kind of like her because she looks like me. And I feel like it's something that, from the outside at first glance, first of all, reflects back to me images that kind of remind me of myself and women that I know. And then also, internally, I just love the fact that it's the superhero who goes around, what's the word? Thwarting little things that irritate me in the city. And not solving someone else's problems, but say like you're on the train and someone's all in your space and sort of like, hey baby, and she knocks those people out. She has a lot of her weapons are sort of things that we take for granted. Like I don't know if you know women who sort of have an accumulation of things on their keychain. And that's one of her weapons, is that accumulation of things on her keychain. It's plated in gold and it actually turns into a serious weapon. She gets people with it. But I really like those. And then another thing that I don't have images of, but I was videotaping artists talking about negotiating aesthetics between their aesthetics that they find normal and aesthetics that are considered normal within Western institutions. And one of her responses was about a performance art piece that she did. I think she's in a residency. She's Puerto Rican, and I believe it actually was in Puerto Rico. And they were in this sort of living kind of resort place. And all the women that were in charge of housekeeping the area were Latina, like her. And then all the people that were on the program were not. And most of them were probably white Americans. And she felt really uncomfortable with that dynamic. And so what she decided to do was to do a performance art piece just for herself, where she went out and bought a uniform just like the women who were working in the sort of resort hotel thing that they were staying at. And she went around and basically cleaned up everything that she dirtied. So she washed all her own dishes. If she dirtied anything, she cleaned it. And she just took photos of it, and she just did it for herself. It was just her way of sort of processing that experience of having these women who she felt were women just like her mother, just like her auntie, you know, and why were they picking up after her and just feeling, not really feeling okay with that. And so she did the piece, saved the photos, and then she presented them. She presented them to different people, and the responses that she got were really interesting, both to herself and to me. And she found that when she showed them to the other people who were on the program, that they were really offended by them, which was really interesting. It was just a very interesting response. And she said that, I remember her quote was that they were asking her why she was trying to change something that already was. And then she also had a professor who asked her why did she want to identify with these women when they weren't her? Because she was college educated, and he was running down the list of things that made her different from these other women. She was like, but no, that's the point, is that I wanted to do this piece because these women are very much women who remind me of my mother and my auntie and the people who've raised me. And this is even, if I wasn't in this program, this is how people would look at me. And what differentiates me from them, other than the fact that you kind of decided that I'm not one of them. And there was a Latina curator who came who totally had the same sort of, I guess, emotional sort of debate going on in her head. She totally understood the piece right away, but it's just differences. Again, it's just things that have happened that I've seen throughout the year that sort of make me think about the differences in the way that we view images of ourselves versus how other people respond to them, and just sort of like what makes that happen and how that affects how people view art. And then these are some pieces that I did a few years ago that kind of played on how people see Black women, and they're Pirate Jennies. Does everyone know the song Pirate Jenny that Nina Simone sings? Does anyone know the song Pirate Jenny that Nina Simone sings? That's so funny. I think it's actually from the Three Penny Opera. It's not actually a Nina Simone song per se, but she re-sang it, and so it sort of, it becomes a song about this woman who's in a, I guess it's like a pub, it's like a really old-fashioned, old-time pub, and she works there, and people are like, hey girl, get me this, do that, and they boss her around any old kind of way, and she's kind of like the lowest person on the totem pole. And there's a ship of pirates that roll into town, and through the song you hear how they're causing, you know, mayhem and madness and taking over the town, and everyone's becoming scared and sort of trying to figure out how to battle them and force them out, and they slowly take over the entire town. And then what happens is that they're all sort of moving towards a central place and rounding people up and bringing them towards the place. And it turns out that what they're doing is bringing them towards this woman that everyone has considered the lowest of the low, because she's actually the queen of the pirate ship. And the way the song ends is that they're asking her, she's like, they're rounding up the bodies and they're bringing them to me, and they're asking me, kill them now or later? And so there's all these people who basically saw her as a non-person, all of a sudden really seeing her as a person because their lives are now in her hands, which is really interesting. It's just a really interesting song. And so I imagined that kind of sentiment that Nina Simone brought to it in that time period, and what the pirates would do at the time that I was making these, and I pictured them kind of responding to the idea of Black women as sort of non-people that I find a lot on the radio. And so these pirates went around basically playing on that idea of Black women as non-people and playing tricks on people based on the things that they were saying. So in this one, there's a song, it's Move. It's really not a nice song, but it's Move. Does everyone know the Pharrell song? It was Pharrell and Busta Rhymes together. And it's Move, be a light that on fire, move. And the song is really repetitive and really obnoxious. So anyways, there's this young Black woman, sort of voluptuous and pretty, and she goes, in the fake news article, she goes up to Pharrell and she literally lights him on fire. And gets away with it because, not in a way that sort of like permanently inflicts harm, but just enough to sort of literally do to him what he jokes about doing to people in the song. And it's sort of this thing that in the song that sort of is taken for granted that you can do this because, I don't know, I guess the women are just not really people in the song. And so she is this person who in real life, he sees as not a person, but she comes and does this thing to him that he jokes constantly on the radio about doing to her. And she's able to do it because of him not seeing her as a real threat anyway. And then, so these are the pirates. I don't know. They're kind of weird things. I kind of feel weird about like putting that kind of aggressive energy out into the world, and I kind of feel better about like putting out positive, not positive, but I don't know. I feel like everything kind of has like repercussions and karma. You sort of put a certain energy out and it kind of comes back to you. So I'd like to not, I don't know. I feel like that's not my ideal way of working. And so what I really like about Diva Dutch is I think it kind of deals with the distance between how we see ourselves and sometimes how other people see us and the nuances of that in a way that's a little bit more, I guess, loving would be a bit less punishing and more loving, and kind of just finding a way for Black women to create public images of themselves that are based upon their own aesthetics, that other people engage with in a way that becomes a part of their memory bank. And so when they think of certain images of Black women or they see images of Black women that may be very stereotypical, hopefully this will also be in their memory bank as well. And so the piece is a piece where Black women are involved, very much in a cut and paste collage kind of way. Wherever I go to, I ask people to be involved. And a lot of times people will go, well, why are you doing that? You know, why are you making a jump rope out of hair? What are you going to do with that? But then once they get involved in the process, they do have aesthetic beliefs about how things should be done, and those aesthetics kick in. So this isn't one, but for instance, with the braids, when I would go to the salon, the women would go, well, why are you doing that? And then the next thing you know, they'd be telling me how it should be done and what made it a beautiful braid and what didn't, and deciding how to make theirs better than the one that the previous person did, and so on. And so the fact that there are aesthetic sensibilities that we do have, and that even though we might not necessarily always call ourselves artists, we do have a set of aesthetics. It's something that I kind of play on with the piece and try to integrate that in. And then again, to do it in such a way where it sort of forms this mass portrait of Black women that's based again on their own belief system and shows things that we consider beautiful about ourselves that other people might not always be privy to. Yeah, that's sort of those are my thoughts on the subject.
So Amelia and I we begin by explaining a little bit about the project we're working on, because we're maybe a little bit more sort of coming in sort of on a side angle or peripheral vision to this talk, in part because the work that we've been collaborating on so far, which is based around Hermitage, which is Andrew Jackson's estate here in Nashville. And in particular, the show that Jody mentioned is about this boy, Linkoya, who was a Creek Indian boy that Jackson's troops killed his parents on the battlefield at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And then Jackson adopted the boy, or sort of sent him home to Andrew Jr. as a replacement for a young slave boy who had recently died. There are a lot of conflicting narratives about it, but we made this show about about his story and about the multiple stories that exist about his life. But now we're in the process of working on a new set of pieces that are going to be sort of in relation to a memorial that's being dedicated at the Hermitage in May. They found a slave burial ground, and they're sort of rededicating the burial ground with this memorial, and we're organizing some pieces to go with that. So that's sort of.
Yeah, we're really excited about the project at the Hermitage. They commissioned a an artist to do public artwork to memorialize, rededicate this memorial of enslaved people who worked at the Hermitage. But then they also thought it would be interesting to have artists do live performances that would go throughout that would sort of join this area where, because the slave burial ground is actually across the highway median from the main grounds of Hermitage. So we're hoping to sort of bring all of these spaces together through performances. So going through the process now.
And we're figuring out what performances we are doing, so if there are people, if this project sounds interesting to any of you along the way, and you're interested in getting involved, you should get in touch with us.
A lot of what we talk about in this particular exhibition is about the way we connect with history or the way we learn about history. I myself come from a family where my mother is an American Indian storyteller, and so her role in our tribe